Sometime around 4,100 years before the birth of Christ, 10,000 people gathered in what is now the Ukrainian steppe and did something that took archaeologists 5,000 years to find and another century to believe. They set fire to their own city. Every building, every house, every structure in a settlement that covered more land than ancient Rome would occupy 3,000 years later. They did it deliberately, carefully, and completely. And then they walked away and built it all again somewhere else. They were not fleeing an enemy. They were not punished by plague or famine. The fires were set from inside the buildings, not outside. Valuables and grain stores had been removed in advance. In some structures, additional fuel had been placed to ensure a more complete burn. This was not destruction. This was a ritual. And the strangest part, they did it again. And again. And again. For 2,700 years, the civilization that practiced this, that burned its own largest cities every 60 to 80 years on purpose for nearly 3 millennia, has no name we know of. They left no writing. They built no monuments. Their cities, once the largest on Earth, are now buried farmland in Ukraine and Moldova. We call them the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, after the 2 modern villages where their artifacts were first recognized in the 1880s. For the 5,000 years between their disappearance and their discovery, no one knew they had existed at all. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what they built. In 4,100 BCE, roughly the same time the first city-states were appearing in Mesopotamia, the Trypillia people were constructing settlements that dwarfed anything else on the planet. The site of Talyanki in central Ukraine covered roughly 450 acres. Modern archaeologists estimate its population at 10,000 to 15,000 people. For context, the famous ancient city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, which most historians credit as the world's first city, held roughly 5,000 to 10,000 people at the same period. The Trypillia megasites were larger, and the sites were not just large, they were planned. Satellite imagery and aerial photography, which became available only in the 20th century, revealed the astonishing truth about Trypillia settlement design. The houses were arranged in concentric oval rings, like the rings of a target, sometimes 3 or 4 rings deep, surrounding a large open central plaza. At Majdanetsky, one of the largest known sites, over 2,700 structures were arranged in this pattern across nearly 1,000 acres. The layout was so consistent across hundreds of sites and thousands of years that it was clearly deliberate, an urban design maintained with extraordinary discipline across dozens of generations. The houses themselves were remarkable, 2-story structures, rare for the Chalcolithic period anywhere in the world. The ground floor was used for grain storage and animal stalls. The upper floor was the living space, with a hearth, sleeping platforms, and an oven used for baking and for firing pottery. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a lattice of woven sticks covered with clay, and the floors were fired clay platforms. Many buildings were painted in red and white designs. They were not primitive huts. They were designed, built, and decorated homes, housing families across multiple generations. The people who built them were farmers, but not simple ones. They grew emmer, wheat, barley, and peas in the incredibly fertile black soil, the Chernozem of the Pontic steppe. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. They were also extraordinary craftspeople. Their pottery is among the most beautiful of the ancient world, painted with swirling spirals and meander patterns in red, black, and white, fired at temperatures that required sophisticated kilns. Their copper tools were state-of-the-art for the period. They traded obsidian from the Carpathian Mountains and copper from the Balkans over networks that stretched hundreds of miles. What they did not have is equally remarkable. In 5,000 years of recorded history, almost every large human settlement eventually produced a ruling class: kings, temples, palaces, monument builders who used mass labor to proclaim divine authority. The Trypillia, who built the largest settlements on Earth for over 1,000 years, show none of this. The houses are roughly equal in size. There is no palace. There is no temple. There is no throne room, no treasury, no mass burial of servants with a dead king. The most egalitarian large-scale human society ever documented may have been the one living in the largest cities on Earth. The burned clay that gives archaeologists so much of their evidence was discovered in the 1880s independently in both Romania, near the village of Cucuteni, and in Ukraine, near the village of Trypillia. For decades, scholars thought the two sets of artifacts belonged to different cultures. It was only in the early 20th century that the full extent of the connection was understood. This was one vast culture spanning hundreds of sites across a region the size of France. The name Cucuteni-Trypillia is the hyphenated compromise between Romanian and Ukrainian archaeological traditions. In some academic circles, it is called the Trypillia culture. They called themselves nothing we know of. The discovery of the megasites, the truly enormous settlements, came even later. Most were invisible at ground level, buried under 5,000 years of soil and covered by active farmland. It was only when aerial photography became widespread in the mid-20th century, and then satellite imagery in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, that researchers began seeing the buried ring patterns from above. The dark circles and ovals in Ukrainian grain fields turned out to be the foundations of buildings that had stood for millennia. Archaeologists had been farming on top of the world's first mega-cities without knowing it. The burning itself was the feature that most puzzled early researchers. Every Trypillia site shows evidence of fire. At first, this seemed like it might explain the culture's disappearance. Enemies, perhaps, or some catastrophe. But the pattern of the fires made no sense as destruction by an outside force. When an enemy burns a city, the fire spreads from where it is set. The gates, the walls, the granaries. At Trypillia sites, the fires appear to have started inside multiple structures simultaneously across the entire settlement. Grain stores had been emptied. Human remains were largely absent. The people were not there when the fire started. The radiocarbon dating made everything stranger. As more sites were dated with precision, a pattern emerged. Individual sites showed burning events, complete destruction of the settlement by fire, occurring at intervals of roughly 60 to 80 years. Not every generation, not every decade, every 2 to 3 generations. And then the site would be abandoned entirely or occasionally reoccupied after a significant gap. Across hundreds of sites spread across modern Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, spanning more than 2,000 years of occupation, the same 60 to 80-year burning interval kept appearing. This was not coincidence. The interval is too consistent, across too many sites, over too long a time, to be anything other than a planned cycle. Something in Trypillia culture determined that a settlement had a lifespan of roughly 60 to 80 years, 2 to 3 human generations, after which it was ritually ended, physically destroyed, and replaced. Whatever the reason, it was encoded deeply enough in their culture to persist for longer than the entire span of recorded history since the fall of Rome. The first major theory for why they did it is practical: soil depletion. The black earth of the Ukrainian steppe is among the most fertile soil on the planet, but it is not inexhaustible. A settlement of 10,000 people farming the same land for 60 to 80 years would have significantly depleted the agricultural potential of the surrounding area. Moving periodically was, in this view, a form of long fallow agriculture applied to entire cities, letting the land around an abandoned settlement recover while the population moved to fresh ground. The burned platform of clay and ash from the destroyed buildings, enriched with decades of organic waste, may even have functioned as fertilizer. The second theory is sanitation. A large settlement that has housed thousands of people for multiple generations accumulates extraordinary quantities of organic waste. In the streets, in the buildings, in the wells and pits. Rodents, insects, and pathogens build up in the fabric of old buildings. The wattle and daub construction, however well made initially, was subject to rot, infestation, and structural decay. After 60 to 80 years, the oldest buildings in a settlement would have been approaching the end of their useful life. Burning everything, streets, buildings, storage pits, all of it, was the most complete possible solution to the problem of accumulated filth and disease. The fire was, in this reading, the world's most thorough spring cleaning. The third theory is social. The Trypillia appear to have maintained their remarkable equality over thousands of years. In almost every other large human settlement in history, accumulation of property and wealth across generations leads inevitably to social stratification. Families that inherit more, accumulate more, and eventually become permanent aristocracies. The periodic burning and relocation of the entire settlement may have been a mechanism for preventing exactly this. You cannot inherit a house that has been burned down. You cannot accumulate property across generations if every 2 to 3 generations everything is destroyed and rebuilt from scratch. The fire was, possibly, a social reset, enforced equality through enforced impermanence. The fourth theory is the most extraordinary. The burning was a ritual killing. In many ancient cultures, houses and settlements were understood as living entities, born when built, alive while inhabited, and in need of a proper death when their time was done. The burning was not destruction. It was a funeral, a ceremony to release the spiritual energy of a place that had served its purpose so that the community could be reborn elsewhere. Under this interpretation, the 60 to 80-year interval was not a practical calculation but a cosmological one. The lifespan of a settlement is determined by some system of belief we no longer have access to. The fire was not the end. It was the beginning of the next cycle. Most archaeologists today believe the answer was probably all of these things at once. A practice that combines practical advantage, better sanitation, renewed soil, prevention of inequality, with deep spiritual meaning is far more likely to persist across 3,000 years than a practice with only one justification. The burning worked on every level simultaneously. It was hygienically sensible, agriculturally sustainable, socially equalizing, and cosmologically meaningful. That combination may be why no generation in 2,700 years ever decided it was time to stop. What life was like inside a Trypillia megasite is something archaeologists are still reconstructing. The scale alone creates organizational questions that still puzzle researchers. How did 10,000 people coordinate the building of a new settlement? Who decided where the rings would go, which direction the entrance would face, which family would occupy which position in the rings? The consistency of the layout, maintained across hundreds of sites over thousands of years, implies some form of planning authority or shared tradition so strong it needed no enforcement. The plans may simply have been known by everyone, passed down through generations, as obvious and unquestioned as the knowledge of which crop to plant in which season. The interior organization of the sites gives some clues. At Nebelivka, one of the best-studied megasites, analysis suggests that the population may have been organized into neighborhood units. Groups of families clustered together in a section of the rings with their own communal facilities. This assembly-based structure suggests the site was not governed by a single central authority but operated more like a federation of neighborhoods, each with its own internal organization but participating in the shared structure of the whole settlement. It was, perhaps, one of the largest-scale experiments in non-hierarchical urban organization in human history. The pottery of the Trypillia people is what first drew archaeologists' attention in the 19th century, and remains their most recognizable legacy. It is extraordinary by any standard. The vessels, bowls, pitchers, storage jars, ritual containers, were built by coiling clay, smoothed by hand, then painted with geometric designs, spirals, meanders, parallel lines, and abstract animal shapes rendered in combinations of red, black, and white. The firing process produced a hard, durable ceramic that preserved beautifully for millennia. In terms of aesthetic sophistication, Trypillia pottery rivals anything produced in the ancient world during the same period. They also produced clay figurines in enormous quantities. Mostly female, stylized rather than realistic, with exaggerated hips and abstract facial features. Thousands have been found across sites. Their exact significance is unknown. They may represent a goddess, an ancestor, a protective spirit, or simply a type of object produced habitually across the culture for reasons that varied by household and occasion. What is clear is that they were produced consistently and in great numbers, and that they often appear in association with domestic activities, cooking, weaving, grain processing, rather than in special ritual spaces, which suggests their spiritual function was embedded in everyday life rather than reserved for temples or priests. There were no priests. There were no temples. This is perhaps the most alien aspect of Trypillia society to modern understanding. Every large-scale civilization we know of eventually developed a specialized religious class. People whose full-time occupation was mediating between the human and divine, maintaining temples, performing rituals, accumulating the wealth that flowed from religious authority. The Trypillia show none of this. Their spiritual life, whatever it was, appears to have been conducted at the household level, without specialists, without dedicated sacred spaces separate from domestic life, and without the hierarchical apparatus that religious specialization invariably produces. How they maintained cosmological coherence across hundreds of sites and thousands of years without any of this institutional apparatus is one of the great mysteries of prehistoric archaeology. The burning ceremony itself may have been the institution that held everything together. If every settlement burned on a similar cycle, and if the burning was a shared cosmological event, the death and rebirth of the community, then the fire was the ritual. It did not need a temple or a priest because it was the entire settlement, involving every person, a moment when the community acted as one to end and begin again. The fire was the ceremony. The rebuilding was the worship. The act of creating a new city from scratch, in the correct pattern, according to the inherited design, was itself the sacred act. The move itself would have been an enormous undertaking. A settlement of 10,000 people abandoning their homes requires a destination, a plan, and resources for construction. The Trypillia appear to have solved this through a process of gradual transition, beginning construction of the new site while the old one was still partially occupied, so that families could move progressively before the final burning. Evidence from some sites suggests the population was already declining before the last fire, as the advanced construction party established the new settlement. The burning, in this model, was the final act for the last residents, a ceremony to close what had been opened before joining the rest of the community at the new site. The new site was typically located within a reasonable distance of the old one, close enough that the same agricultural land could continue to be used from a different center, but far enough to be on fresh ground for construction. The community was not nomadic. They were not wandering across the steppe. They were cycling through a landscape, maintaining deep roots in a region over centuries while physically relocating within it. The relationship between a Trypillia community and its territory was long-term and intimate, even as the specific location of habitation shifted. They were tied to their land. They were not tied to their buildings. The scale of the building effort at each new site is staggering to contemplate. At Majdanetsky, 2,700 structures. If we assume a 2-year construction period, which would be generous, given that these were hand-built structures using locally gathered materials. That is more than 3 new buildings completed every day, for 2 years, while the community was simultaneously farming, tending animals, producing pottery, caring for children, and maintaining all the other activities of a large agricultural settlement. The construction of a Trypillia megasite was a collective effort on a scale that rivals any of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and yet it has left no monument, no inscription, no record of triumph. One significant detail about the burned structures has attracted particular attention. The clay used in Trypillia buildings, when exposed to the intense heat of a deliberately fueled fire, vitrified. It transformed into a material similar to fired ceramic, hard and durable. The burned platforms of destroyed Trypillia settlements are consequently some of the most physically preserved archaeological sites in the region. The burning, paradoxically, created the evidence of the culture's existence. If the Trypillia had simply abandoned their buildings and let them decay naturally over 5,000 years, almost nothing would remain. By burning them, they inadvertently preserved their traces in a form that could survive millennia. The fire that ended the city also saved it from oblivion. The Trypillia culture began to decline around 3,200 BCE. The megasites, which had grown steadily larger for nearly 1,000 years, stopped growing and began shrinking. The interval between burning and rebuilding extended. Some sites were abandoned without burning, which is highly unusual and suggests the normal social order was breaking down. By 2700 BCE, the culture had effectively disappeared. The largest urban civilization of the ancient world, the one that had been building and burning cities for 2,700 years, was gone. 2 forces appear to have driven the collapse. The first was climate. Around 3,200 BCE, the region that is now Ukraine and Moldova experienced a significant climatic shift. A prolonged period of cooler, drier conditions that reduced agricultural productivity. The farming that had fed tens of thousands of people in the megasites became less reliable. Smaller settlements were more sustainable under reduced agricultural conditions than enormous ones. The megasite model, which required feeding very large concentrated populations, was particularly vulnerable to agricultural stress. The second force was the arrival of the Yamna culture from the east. The Yamna, sometimes called the pit grave culture, were pastoral nomads from the Pontic-Caspian steppe who had mastered horses and wheeled vehicles and were expanding westward through the grasslands around 3,000 to 2,500 BCE. Whether their relationship with the Trypillia was primarily violent or primarily competitive for resources is debated, But the result was the same. The Trypillia world, already stressed by climate change, could not maintain the massive concentrated settlements that had defined it. The megasites were abandoned. The culture dissolved. The Yamna people who replaced the Trypillia in the region are now understood, through ancient DNA analysis, to have been among the primary ancestors of modern European populations. The genetic legacy of the Trypillia themselves. What proportion of modern Europeans descend from them versus from the Yamna is still being worked out by geneticists. What appears clear is that the Trypillia were not simply eliminated, but were to some degree absorbed, their genes passing into the populations that replaced their culture. The largest civilization most people have never heard of may be among the ancestors of most people reading these words. The rediscovery of the Trypillia world in the modern era has been driven largely by technology. Aerial photography in the mid-20th century first revealed the ring patterns that defined their settlements. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, tools that can see buried structures without excavation, have allowed archaeologists to map entire megasites that would have taken decades to excavate. Satellite imagery from commercial providers has enabled researchers to identify new sites across Ukraine at a rate impossible through traditional field survey. Each advance in remote sensing technology reveals more of a world that was invisible for 5 millennia. Excavation at Nebelivka, one of the most systematically studied megasites, has produced a rich picture of daily life. The finds include grinding stones for grain processing, loom weights for weaving, antler and bone tools for leatherworking, copper axes and chisels, clay weights for fishing nets, and, in enormous quantities, pottery, children's toys in fired clay, miniature clay models of buildings that may have been planning tools or ritual objects or simply playthings. Evidence of feasting on a massive scale in the central plaza. The Trypillia were not living at the edge of subsistence. They were comfortable, varied, and productive. They were prosperous by any reasonable definition of the word. The question of what the Trypillia thought about their own practice, what they told their children when asked why they burned everything, what cosmological story they told to make sense of the cycle of building and burning, is permanently closed to us. They had no writing. The oral traditions that must have carried their worldview across 100 generations are gone as completely as the settlements themselves. We see the behavior. We see the material remains. We see the pattern. But the meaning, the reason they gave to themselves, we cannot know. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Trypillia story. A culture that maintained a coherent, complex, shared ritual practice for 3,000 years and left no explanation. Analogies from other cultures offer possible windows into the reasoning. Ritual burning of structures is documented across many cultures worldwide. The destruction of a chief's possessions at death in Polynesia, the periodic abandonment and burning of longhouses among some North American peoples, the ritual destruction of objects at the end of calendar cycles in Mesoamerica. In virtually every case where we have textual or ethnographic evidence, the burning is about transition and renewal. The end of something that has served its purpose, making way for something new. The fire is not punishment. The fire is release. What makes the Trypillia unique is not just that they burned. It is the scale, the consistency, and the duration. Burning a single house, or even a single settlement, is one thing. Maintaining a culture-wide practice of burning your largest cities at regular intervals across hundreds of sites and dozens of generations for nearly 3,000 years. That is something that requires not just belief, but institutional embedding so deep that no generation ever questioned it seriously enough to stop. Whatever the Trypillia believed about fire, they believed it with a conviction and consistency that puts almost any other religious or social practice in human history to shame. The modern nations whose territory contains Trypillia sites, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, have increasingly recognized the cultural significance of this prehistoric civilization. Ukrainian archaeologists in particular have worked to document and preserve Trypillia sites even as the Russian invasion of Ukraine since 2022 has threatened the infrastructure of archaeological research and, in some cases, the sites themselves. The ancient burned cities of the Ukrainian steppe are now at risk from a different kind of fire, one that is neither ritualized nor purposeful, but the opposite. The Trypillia lasted longer than the Roman Empire. They lasted longer than the Egyptian dynasties. They lasted longer than any organized civilization in recorded history, with the exception of ancient China. They built cities larger than anything their contemporaries could manage. They maintained social equality at a scale and for a duration that no subsequent large society has matched. And every 2 to 3 generations, they proved their commitment to all of this by burning everything to the ground and starting again. Whether this was wisdom or madness, pragmatism or faith, survival strategy or spiritual imperative, perhaps it was all of these. We cannot say. But it worked. For 2,700 years, it worked. While the Egyptians were learning to write and the Mesopotamians were building ziggurats and the Minoan culture had not yet begun, the people of the Ukrainian steppe were building cities larger than anything else on the planet, burning them every 2 to 3 generations with the whole community present, and walking calmly to the place where the new city was already rising. We do not know their name for themselves. We do not know the name they gave the ceremony. We do not know the words they spoke as the fire caught. What we know is that they did it, over and over and over, for longer than Rome existed, for longer than medieval Europe lasted, for longer than the time between Charlemagne and the present day. They burned their cities on purpose, and then they built them again, and for 2,700 years, that was enough.